Chris Watts stood before the cameras on the 14th of August, 2018. His eyes were red, his voice cracked, his hands trembled just enough. He looked directly into the lens and said the words that every parent in America felt in their chest. Please, if anyone has seen my family, my wife Shanann, my daughters Bella and Celeste, please bring them home. The footage aired on every local station in Colorado by 6 that evening. By midnight it had gone national. Facebook groups formed within hours. Volunteers organized search parties. Strangers prayed for a man they had never met, because his pain looked so real, so raw, so unmistakable. 48 hours later, that same man sat across from a federal agent in a small room and said 3 words that no one in that room will ever forget. I killed them. Miles GhostHunter here, and this is the story of the most photographed, most documented, most publicly loved family in Frederick, Colorado. A family that smiled in every single picture. A family that never missed a holiday post. A family that looked so perfect, so impossibly happy, that when they vanished, no one could imagine what had actually happened inside that house on Saratoga Trail. No one, except the man who lived there. Let me take you back. Not to the crime, not yet. First, you need to understand who Shanann Watts was. Because if you do not know who she was when she was alive, you will never understand the full weight of what was taken. Shanann Ruzacek was born on January 11th, 1984, in Passaic, New Jersey. She grew up in a tight Italian-American family. Her parents, Frank Sr. and Sandra Ruzacek, raised her alongside her brother Frankie Jr. They were not wealthy, they were working class. But the house was loud, the meals were big, and the family was close in the way that only families who have been through hard times together can be. Shanann had lupus. She was diagnosed young, and the disease followed her through every stage of her life. Chronic pain, medications, surgeries, hospital stays that ate through whatever savings she managed to build. But here is what everyone who knew her will tell you first. She never stopped moving. She was not the type to sit in a dark room and feel sorry for herself. She was the type to post a video from the hospital bed with a full face of makeup and a smile that could sell you anything. And eventually, that is exactly what she did. In 2012, Shanann met Christopher Lee Watts. He was from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Quiet, agreeable, the kind of man who did not argue, did not push back, did not raise his voice. His family described him as easy. His co-workers described him as invisible. If you put Chris Watts in a room with 10 people, he would be the one you forgot was there. But Shanann did not see invisible. Shanann saw potential. She saw a man who could be shaped, directed, improved. And Chris, for his part, saw something he had never had before: attention, purpose. Someone who told him what to do and made him feel like he mattered while doing it. They married on November 3rd, 2012, in Charlotte, North Carolina. Within 2 years they had their first daughter, Bella Marie Watts, born December 17th, 2013. A quiet girl, serious eyes. She liked to read, she liked to draw. She was the kind of child who noticed things that adults missed. Then came Celeste Catherine Watts, born July 17, 2015. Cece was the opposite of Bella, loud, fearless. She ran before she could properly walk. She had an allergy to tree nuts so severe that Shanann carried an EpiPen everywhere. Everywhere. It was the first thing Shanann packed, and the last thing she checked. By 2016, the Watts family had moved to Frederick, Colorado, a small community about 30 miles north of Denver. Flat land, new construction, HOA rules and cul-de-sacs and neighbors who waved from their driveways. They bought a house on 2624 Saratoga Trail. 4 bedrooms, a basement, a yard. The kind of house you buy when you believe the brochure. And Shanann turned that house into a stage. She was a promoter for a health company called Lavelle. She sold Thrive patches, shakes, supplements. But what she really sold was the idea of herself, the idea of a life. She posted constantly. Facebook, Instagram, videos of family dinners, videos of the girls dancing, videos of Chris pretending to be annoyed while secretly loving the attention. She tagged him in everything. She wrote captions about gratitude, about blessings, about her amazing husband who supported her dreams. If you scrolled through Shanann Watts' Facebook page in the summer of 2018, you would see a woman who had it all. 2 beautiful daughters, a handsome husband, a big house, a thriving business, a baby on the way. Yes, Shanann was pregnant, 15 weeks, a boy. They had already picked the name, Nico Lee Watts, named after both of his parents. Chris chose the middle name himself. That was the version of the Watts family that existed online. That was the version that America saw. The version that made the disappearance so shocking, so inexplicable, that the entire town of Frederick rallied behind a man who stood on his porch and cried into a camera. Now, let me show you the version that nobody posted about. The finances were a catastrophe. Shanann and Chris had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. They owed over $400,000, credit cards, medical bills, car payments on vehicles they could not afford. The bankruptcy gave them a temporary reprieve. But by 2018, they were drowning again. The mortgage on Saratoga Trail was over $2,700 a month. Shanann's Thrive income was inconsistent. Chris made $61,000 a year as an operator at Anadarko Petroleum. On paper, they were underwater. In reality, they were sinking. But the posts kept coming, the smiles kept flashing, the hashtags kept multiplying. Blessed, grateful, living my best life. Behind those hashtags, the marriage was disintegrating. In the summer of 2018, Shanann took the girls to North Carolina for 5 weeks to visit her family. She had a falling out with Chris's mother, Cindy Watts, over the nut allergy. Cindy had kept ice cream with tree nuts in the house, despite knowing about Cece's condition. The fight escalated. Lines were drawn. Shanann told Chris to choose, his wife and children, or his mother. Chris chose neither. Chris chose silence. And in that silence, while his wife and daughters were 1,000 miles away, Chris Watts became someone else entirely. He lost weight, 15 pounds in 5 weeks. He started wearing different clothes. He changed his hair. He began listening to Metallica, a band he had never cared about before. His co-workers at Anadarko noticed. His neighbors noticed. But nobody asked, because he seemed happier than he had ever been. He was. And the reason had a name. But we will get to her. August 13th, 2018, a Monday. Shanann flew back from Arizona, where she had been at a Thrive Company event with her friend Nicole Atkinson. The flight landed late. Shanann was exhausted. She was 15 weeks pregnant, battling nausea, and had spent the weekend working. Nicole Atkinson drove Shanann home from Denver International Airport. They pulled up to 2624 Saratoga Trail at 1:48 in the morning. Shanann grabbed her suitcase, waved goodbye, and walked to the front door. The doorbell camera, their own doorbell camera, the one Shanann had installed months earlier, recorded the moment she entered the house. 1:48 a.m. The door opened. The door closed. That was the last time anyone outside that house saw Shanann Watts alive. The next morning, Nicole Atkinson had plans with Shanann. They were supposed to go to a doctor's appointment together at 10 a.m. Nicole texted Shanann at 7. No response. She texted again at 8. Nothing. She called at 9. Straight to voicemail. Nicole Atkinson knew Shanann Watts, knew her rhythms, knew that Shanann never missed a text, never let her phone die, never went silent for more than 30 minutes without an explanation. And Shanann was pregnant. She had an appointment. She was not the kind of person who just disappeared. By 11:30, Nicole was at the house. She rang the bell. She banged on the door. She called Chris at work. He answered casually. Said he did not know where Shanann was. Said he was at a job site. Said she was probably at a friend's house. His voice was flat, not worried, not confused, flat. Nicole called the police at 1:40 p.m. Officer Scott Kuntz of the Frederick Police Department arrived at the house at 1:52 p.m. Chris Watts was already on his way home from work. He arrived minutes later and let the officer inside. The house was clean, unremarkably clean. Shanann's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was between the couch cushions. Her wedding ring sat on the nightstand beside the bed. Her shoes were by the door. Her suitcase from the trip, the one she had carried in at 1:48 that morning, was still in the front hallway, unpacked. Bella's and Cece's car seats were in the garage. Their shoes were in their rooms. Their blankets were in their beds. Everything was there, except the people. Officer Kuntz asked Chris the standard questions. When did you last see your wife? Chris said around 5:15 that morning, when he left for work. She was asleep. The girls were asleep. Everything was normal. He said they had had an emotional conversation the night before, about their marriage, about separation. He said Shanann had told him she was going to take the girls to a friend's house, but she left her phone, she left her purse, she left her car, she left her wedding ring, she left the medication she took every single day, she left the EpiPen that she never, not once, left behind, and she took nothing. That evening, Chris Watts stood on his porch and spoke to reporters from Denver 7. The camera framed him against the garage door of 2624 Saratoga Trail. He wore a blue shirt. He rocked on his heels. He looked into the lens and delivered the performance that would be replayed 10 million times. I just want them back. I want to see everybody. I want to see everybody just come running in through that door. He paused. He wiped his eye. He said Shanann was his everything. He said he missed the girls and the house felt empty without them. Social media erupted. Prayers poured in. GoFundMe pages appeared. Shanann's Facebook friends shared her posts, her videos, her smiling face, and begged for information. The country was watching a man fall apart in real time, and the country believed every second of it. Almost every person who watched that footage believed Chris Watts. Almost. Nate Trinostich did not. Nate lived next door to the Watts family. He was not a detective. He was a neighbor, not an analyst. He was a neighbor with a Vivint security system that included a camera mounted above his garage. That camera had a wide-angle view, wide enough to capture the driveway and the front of the Watts house. On the afternoon of August 13th, when the police first arrived, they asked Nate if his camera had captured anything. Nate said yes. But when Chris Watts was standing in Nate's living room, watching the footage alongside the officers, Nate noticed something. Chris was not watching the screen the way a desperate husband watches a screen. He was not leaning forward. He was not pointing. He was not saying there, that shadow, who is that? Chris was standing with his arms crossed, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were not searching. They were calculating. Nate Trinostich told the officers he would give them the full footage, and when the officers reviewed it without Chris present, they saw what Chris did not want them to see. At 5:27 a.m. on August 13th, the camera captured Chris Watts backing his work truck, a grey Anadarko Petroleum Ford F250, into the driveway, not pulling in forward the way a person does when they are going to work, backing in toward the garage. The camera showed Chris loading something into the bed of the truck. The resolution was not high enough to identify exactly what, but the shape, the way he moved, the way he lifted and shifted and adjusted. He made multiple trips between the garage and the truck bed. He was not carrying toolboxes. He was not loading work equipment. And then, at 5:46 a.m., Chris drove away. 19 minutes after he backed in. 27 minutes after Shanann walked through the front door. The camera footage told a story, but it did not tell the whole story. Not yet. Detective Dave Baumhover of the Frederick Police Department and Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation took over the case on August 14th. By this point, it was a missing persons investigation, officially. But Baumhover and Lee did not treat it like one. They treated it like something else entirely. They pulled Shanann's phone records. Her last outgoing text was sent at 11:07 p.m. on August 12th to Chris from the airport. She wrote about their marriage, about wanting to fix things, about how she loved him. Chris's response was brief, distracted. He said he loved her too. Then silence. No activity on Shanann's phone after 1:48 a.m. No texts, no calls, no app usage, no GPS movement. The phone went dead at the house and stayed dead. They pulled Chris's phone records, and this is where the picture changed. Chris Watts had been in constant communication with a woman named Nicole Kessinger. Not Nicole, Nicole, Kessinger, a geologist who worked for a contractor at Anadarko Petroleum. They had been exchanging hundreds of texts a day, phone calls lasting an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, for 6 weeks, since early July. On the night of August 12th, while Shanann was flying home from Arizona, Chris was on the phone with Nicole Kessinger. They talked for 111 minutes. The call ended at 11:20 p.m., 23 minutes before Shanann sent her last text, 88 minutes before Shanann walked through the door. The investigators did not confront Chris with this immediately. They filed it. They waited. They needed more. On August 15th, 2 days after the disappearance, Chris Watts agreed to take a polygraph examination administered by the FBI. He arrived at the Frederick Police Department at 10 a.m. He was cooperative. He was polite. He said he had nothing to hide. The examiner asked 3 questions relevant to the case. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Do you know where Shanann is now? Are you lying about the last time you saw Shanann? Chris answered no to all 3. The machine said he was lying on all 3. After the polygraph, Agent Tammy Lee and Detective Baumhover brought Chris into an interview room. They told him the results. They told him they knew about Nicole Kessinger. They told him they had the phone records. They told him they had the neighbor's camera footage. They told him that the evidence was forming a picture, and that picture did not match the story he was telling. Chris adjusted. He shifted, and then he tried something. He tried a version of the truth that he thought might save him. He said Shanann had done something terrible. He said he woke up on the morning of August 13th and looked at the baby monitor and saw Shanann strangling their daughters. He said he saw Bella's face turning blue. He said he confronted Shanann, and in a blind rage, he put his hands around her neck and squeezed until she stopped moving. He cried as he said this. His face collapsed. He looked like a man who had been destroyed by his own wife's madness. This was the version Chris Watts wanted the world to believe. The protective father. The man who snapped because his children were being hurt. The man who did something terrible but only because something more terrible was already happening. Agent Tammy Lee listened. She nodded. She let him finish. And then she asked the question that cut through everything. If Shanann killed the girls, Chris, why did you put all 3 of them in your truck and drive them to an oil site 45 minutes away? Chris did not have an answer for that. He did not have an answer because there was no answer. Because Shanann did not hurt those children. Because the baby monitor footage did not show what he claimed. Because the entire story was a construction built in the 20 minutes between the polygraph room and the interview room, assembled from desperation and the fading hope that someone, anyone, might still believe him. Nobody did. Not Agent Tammy Lee, not Detective Baumhover, not the FBI agents watching through the glass. And not his own father, Ronnie Watts, who was brought to the police station that afternoon at Chris's request. Chris wanted to confess to his father first. That was his one condition. He wanted his dad in the room. Ronnie Watts sat across from his son, and Chris told him, I killed them, all of them, Shanann, Bella, "Celeste, I killed them all, Dad." Ronnie Watts did not scream. He did not stand up. He did not leave the room. He sat in the chair and stared at the table and said nothing for a very long time. Chris Watts led investigators to the Survey 319 oil battery. It was an Anadarko petroleum well site located 45 minutes east of Frederick, in a remote stretch of Weld County. Flat land, no houses, no traffic, just equipment and silence and oil tanks rising out of the dirt. He showed them the shallow grave first. Shanann's body was buried in a trench at the base of an oil tank. She was wrapped in a bedsheet. She was face down. Her hands were free. There were no ligature marks on her wrists. She had not been tied. She had not fought with ropes. She had been overpowered in her sleep. Then he showed them the tanks. There were 2 crude oil storage tanks at Survey 319. Each one was approximately 12 feet tall, roughly 8 feet in diameter, and contained a hatch at the top that measured only 8 inches across. 8 inches. Bella Watts was inside one tank. Celeste Watts was inside the other. Chris Watts had taken his daughters, 4 years old and 3 years old, and pushed their bodies through openings barely wider than a dinner plate. To get them through the hatches, their shoulders had to compress. Their bodies had to fold. The recovery team would later describe the process of extracting them as one of the most difficult operations they had ever conducted. Not because of the oil, not because of the depth, because of the size of the openings and the fact that the bodies had been submerged in crude petroleum for 3 days. The girls were pulled from those tanks on August 16, 2018, 3 days after their father had put them there. Now, Miles GhostHunter has to tell you something. I have to go back. Because Chris Watts told his version, and then he told another version, and then months later, from a prison cell in Wisconsin, he told a third version. And the third version is the one that investigators believe is the closest to what actually happened that night. This is what happened inside 2624 Saratoga Trail in the early hours of August 13, 2018. Shanann came home at 1:48 a.m. She was exhausted, nauseous, 15 weeks pregnant. She walked in, left her suitcase by the door, and went upstairs. Chris was in bed, or pretending to be. They talked about the marriage, about separation, about what was going to happen next. Shanann told Chris she was willing to fight for them. Chris, who had been rehearsing this moment in his head for weeks, told her he was not. According to the third confession, given to investigators from the Wisconsin Department of Corrections in February 2019, Chris straddled Shanann as she lay face down in bed. He pressed his weight onto her back and wrapped his hands around her throat from behind. Shanann woke up. She fought. She clawed at his hands. She tried to push herself up from the mattress. Chris described her fingernails digging into his skin. He said she asked him one question during the attack. "What are you doing?" He held the pressure for approximately 4 minutes. Shanann went limp. Her unborn son, Nico, 15 weeks in the womb, died with her. Chris pulled his hands away and stared at the ceiling. Then he heard a voice, a small voice, from the doorway. "Daddy, what happened to Mommy?" Bella was standing in the hallway, 4 years old. She had heard the noise and come out of her room. She was standing in her pajamas holding a stuffed animal, looking at her father kneeling over her mother's body. Chris told Bella to go back to bed. Bella obeyed. He stripped the bed. He wrapped Shanann's body in a fitted sheet. He carried her down the stairs, through the kitchen, into the garage. He put her in the bed of his Anadarko truck. Then he went back upstairs. He woke Celeste, who was still asleep. He picked her up. He picked up Bella. He carried both girls downstairs and put them in the back seat of the truck, in their car seats. At 5:27 a.m., the neighbor's camera captured Chris backing the truck out of the garage. Both girls were alive, sitting in their car seats. Their dead mother was in the truck bed behind them, wrapped in a sheet, He drove 45 minutes to Survey 319. The route took him east on Highway 52, then north on a dirt road. It was still dark when he arrived. He carried Shanann's body to the base of the oil tank and buried her in a shallow trench. Then he returned to the truck. Bella and Celeste were still in their car seats, awake. They had been awake for the entire drive. Chris took Celeste first. In the third confession, Chris described what happened at Survey 319 in detail that the investigators had not heard before. He smothered Celeste first. He placed a blanket over her face and pressed. Cece did not struggle long. She was 3. She weighed 30 pounds. It was over in minutes. He carried her body to the first oil tank, climbed the catwalk, opened the 8-inch hatch, and forced her through. Then he went back to the truck for Bella. Bella was alive. Bella was awake. Bella had been sitting in her car seat while her father killed her sister outside the truck. She could not see what was happening from where she sat, but she could hear the sounds. The footsteps on the metal catwalk, the clang of the hatch, the silence that followed. When Chris opened the truck door and reached for Bella, she said one thing. "Daddy, no." She knew. A 4-year-old girl looked at her father and understood what was about to happen. Not the mechanics of it, not the logic, but the meaning. She knew that something terrible had happened to Cece. She knew that her mother was not moving, and she knew that her father, the man who had carried her to bed every night, was going to do something to her that she could not stop. Chris carried Bella to the second oil tank. He placed a blanket over her face. Bella fought. She thrashed. She bit the inside of the blanket. The autopsy would later find scrape marks on the inside of her mouth, consistent with biting down on fabric. She fought with everything a 4-year-old body could produce. It was not enough. Chris Watts pushed his second daughter through an 8-inch hatch into a tank of crude oil. Then he climbed down from the catwalk. He walked back to his truck. He drove to a different part of the site to begin his workday. He texted his supervisor that he was at Survey 319, doing routine maintenance. At 8:25 a.m., while his daughters floated in oil and his wife lay in a shallow grave beneath the Colorado sun, Chris Watts sent a text message to Nicole Kessinger. It said, "Did you have a good weekend?" Now let me tell you about Nicole Kessinger, because the internet has told you about her already, and most of what the internet has told you is either wrong or incomplete. Nicole Kessinger was 30 years old. She was a geologist working for Tasman Geosciences, a contractor at Anadarko Petroleum. She met Chris Watts in June of 2018 on a job site. She described him as quiet, attentive, and unlike anyone she had dated before. He told her he was in the final stages of a divorce. He told her his wife had moved out. He told her the marriage was over and that he was starting a new life. He lied about everything. Nicole did not know about Shanann's pregnancy until August 14th, when the news broke. She did not know that Chris and Shanann still lived in the same house. She did not know that the Facebook posts about the happy family were still going up as recently as July. She knew a version of Chris Watts that did not exist. When Nicole learned the truth, she called the police herself. She turned over her phone. She handed over every text, every photo, every call log. She cooperated fully, voluntarily, and without a lawyer present for her first interview. She told investigators everything she knew, including details about Chris's behavior in the weeks before the murders that would later prove critical. She told them that in late July, Chris had searched the internet for the lyrics to a song called Battery by Metallica. She told them he had become increasingly distant from his family. She told them he had talked about wanting a fresh start, wanting freedom, wanting a life that felt like his own. What she could not tell them was why. Because Chris Watts never told anyone why. Not fully, not honestly, not in any of the 3 confessions. The closest he came was in the Wisconsin interview, when he said that on the night of August 12th, lying in bed, waiting for Shanann to come home, he felt nothing. Not anger, not hatred, not fear, nothing. He said it was like a switch had been turned off inside him. like the part of his brain that connected him to other people had simply gone dark. The prosecutors in Weld County had a choice. They could take the case to trial, which would mean putting Bella's words and Cece's final moments in front of a jury. It would mean crime scene photographs projected on a screen. It would mean Shanann's autopsy report read aloud in a courtroom. It would mean Ronnie and Cindy Watts on one side of the gallery and Frank and Sandra Razuchek on the other. Or they could offer a plea. The Razuchek family was consulted, Shanann's parents, the people who had lost their daughter, their 2 granddaughters, and their unborn grandson. They were asked whether they wanted a trial. Frank Razuchek Sr. said he did not want to hear the details in court. He did not want to see the photographs. He did not want to sit in a room and listen to the defense team attempt to justify what Chris Watts had done to his family. The deal was simple. Chris Watts would plead guilty to all charges. 9 counts total. 5 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. In exchange, the death penalty would be taken off the table. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts stood in a Weld County courtroom and pleaded guilty. Judge Marcelo Kopkow asked him if he understood the charges. Chris said yes. The judge asked if anyone had coerced or threatened him into the plea. Chris said no. The judge asked if he was entering the plea voluntarily. Chris said yes. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 48 years for the tampering charges, plus an additional 12 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy. Chris Watts will die in prison. That is a mathematical certainty. He is currently housed at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He was transferred there from the Colorado Department of Corrections for his own safety, after receiving multiple death threats from inmates and guards alike. He has given multiple interviews since his incarceration. He has written letters. He has found religion. He has told people that he prays for forgiveness every day. He has told interviewers that he thinks about Bella and Celeste constantly. I do not care what he thinks about. I do not care what he prays for, and neither should you. Because here is what I want you to remember from this story. Not the oil tanks, not the 8-inch hatches, not the shallow grave. Those details are burned into your brain now, and they will stay there whether you want them to or not. What I want you to remember is the video. Go back to the beginning, August 14th, 2018. Chris Watts on his porch, blue shirt, red eyes, trembling hands, looking into the camera and saying, "Please bring them back. I want to see everybody just come running through that door." Every word was a lie, but it did not look like a lie. It looked like grief. It looked like a father in agony. It looked like a husband drowning in fear. It looked so real that millions of people watched it and felt their hearts break for a man who had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters 12 hours earlier and stuffed their bodies into the dirt and crude oil. That is what this story is about. Not the killing, the performance, the mask, the thousands of Facebook photos and the smiling faces and the hashtags and the matching pajamas, and the way we all looked at the screen and said, "What a beautiful family," without ever once asking what happens when the camera turns off. Shanann Watts posted her last Facebook video on August 9th, 2018, 4 days before she died. It was a Thrive promotional video. She was smiling. She was talking about health and wellness and living your best life. In the background, you can hear Bella and Celeste playing. The video got 112 likes. Shanann is buried in New Jersey. She was laid to rest at Sacred Heart Cemetery in Pineville, North Carolina initially. Her family later arranged for her remains and the girls' remains to be moved closer to home. They are together now. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Chris Watts is alive. He is healthy. He eats 3 meals a day. He sleeps in a bed. He writes letters and reads books and occasionally speaks to journalists who want to understand why. There is no why. Not one that makes sense. not one that satisfies the question. A man who had everything a person could want on paper. A wife who loved him publicly, 2 daughters who called him daddy, a son on the way. Looked at all of it and decided it was easier to kill them than to leave them. Shanann deserved a husband who would have just filed for divorce. Bella deserved a father who did not make her say daddy no. Celeste deserved more than 30 pounds of fight against a grown man's hands. Nico deserved a first breath. None of them got what they deserved. That is the story of 2624 Saratoga Trail. That is the story of Frederick, Colorado. That is the story of the Watts family. Miles, Ghost Hunter, watch your back. And in the next episode, Christmas Eve, 2002, Lacey Peterson, 8 months pregnant, vanishes from her home in Modesto, California. Her husband Scott tells police he was fishing, alone, on Christmas Eve, in the exact body of water where her remains would surface 4 months later. Subscribe now, because the story of Scott Peterson will make you question every person who has ever said, "Trust me."